Hello everyone, my name is Karեն Այվազյան. I'm a researcher in the field of civil society, and in the last 2 years I have been researching on the topic of civil society shrinking space in Europe and worldwide. Today I'm honored to be having this lecture with you all, talking about the civil society and civic activism in Armenia and the phenomenon of shrinking space in the Armenian reality. When we talk about the Armenian civil society, we need to go back to the 80s of the 20th century, because in the Soviet time, the civil society basically was not existing, or it was it has a forced participation by the government, by the Soviet rule. But when the collapse of Soviet Union it already was approaching, there have been some organizations appearing already in the early 90s and showing the signs of formation of the new civil society in the new independent Armenia. In the beginning, the civil society organizations have been focusing mainly on the humanitarian aid because of the earthquake in Spitak and also the first Nagorno-Karabakh war. There was a need of relief projects, so the international organizations have put their efforts to establishing local NGOs for responding to the ongoing humanitarian crisis. And this is how basically the new civil society development has started in early 90s, and then it took another turn after the 1996 when the growing amount of the civil society organization made the government to come up with a law on the civil society. And the law has passed in 1996, which also resulted in creation of many more civil society organizations and involvement of international donors in Armenia. The development of the NGOs of the civil society took its peak in early 2000s, and many more international organizations started to invest in the civil society development in Armenia. It started with the humanitarian aid, but then it transformed to the work on human rights and democracy with the democratization process of Armenia. In early 2000s, alongside with the civil society organizations, new form of the civil society actors has formed, which was the civic activists, civic initiatives under the elections. The first group has appeared in 2003 after the elections, but the new initiatives, civic initiatives, have been more active after the elections in 2008. And this is where the civil society went from the being a humanitarian one to the protesting one. And alongside with the transition, the civil society has took a lot of changes and transferring, and new NGOs have come up with new ideas on the topic based on the local needs, which included also human rights and democracy. And this also has to have this also is the result of the foreign policy of Armenia, with especially EU and with the neighborhood policy of the European Union. So the EU started to invest more, and Council of Europe, which already has been a huge support for Armenia from 2001, started to support the human rights and democracy in Armenia through the local NGOs. Throughout these years, the civil society has played a very vital role in democratization of Armenia, in supporting different vulnerable groups and affecting on the policy. And this is where the problem has come with the different governments about the perception of the civil society, as it was a new phenomenon in the Armenian reality. It has always come with some challenges, and the civil society has been challenged during this year. And the government has seen, most of the governments has seen the civil society not as counterparts for policy making, for more comprehensive approach to the policies, but rather seeing a threat, and especially seeing a threat in the civil society organizations which have been supported by the foreign funders, foreign organizations, and have had the political agenda, political orientation. So this is how the government has started to come up with measures which will hinder the activities of the civil society organization. When it comes to the relations between the civil society, state, and business actor, it's very important to mention that this is where the civic space, the term of civic space comes up. So there are three main pillars of the society, which is the public sector, which is the government, and also the private sector. So the space between those is the space where the civic action and public discourse takes place, and it's used to call the civic space. And when the NGOs start to challenge the government or the private sector, the space gets narrow and basically shrinks. When we talk about the civil society in the Eastern Partnership countries, which are Armenia, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Azerbaijan, and Belarus, we can see that throughout 2019, the score of the Armenian civil society given by the Freedom House, Freedom in the World Index, the civil society score has been very stable until 2019, when there was a little bit of improvement, according to the Freedom House, because of the involvement of civil society actors in the politics. Basically, after the revolution, civil society actors have got some positions, higher positions in the government, which has been seen as an improvement. However, in my opinion, after the revolution, when the civil society has moved to the government, there was a huge gap in the civil society and between the government as well. As the civil society actors have been there, I could see a notion of not involving civil society in the decision-making process. So I think most of the civil society organizations whose representatives have been already in the government, and they have not been asked for opinion when they came up with the decision. So when we talk about the space and narrowing the space, it's very important to conceptualize what shrinking space is. The term of shrinking space is referred to a process of repression on civil society to prevent civic engagement and to minimize control, shut down external support for democracy and human rights. The concept is defined as dynamic relations between repressive methods and political struggle. When we talk about the civil society development, we need to distinguish between the civil society, how developed the civil society is, and the shrinking space growth. And during my research, I have come up with the Shrinking Space Growth Index, which showed that civil society has a vital role in the democratization process. However, the development of civil society is not really depending on the shrinking space growth. So there is no interrelation between the civil society development and shrinking space growth. For example, in Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, the civil society score given by the Freedom House is higher than in Armenia, Belarus, or Azerbaijan. However, if we see through the research, we can see that the shrinking space growth index is higher in those countries which have more developed civil society organizations than in the ones which are not that much developed or are not ranked as high as the others. And this is showing that if the civil society is growing, the government is really seeing the challenge that may come with the development of the civil society. So in Armenia, if we compare the results of 2005 and 2006 to 2017, we can see that there was reduction of the shrinking space by 3%. And this data is retrieved from the Eastern Partnership Index. So there was improvement in terms of the shrinking space growth. So what are the measures that the governments are usually using in Armenia and also in some other countries throughout the world to repress the most challenging civil society organizations? We can categorize and put into two different classifications of these types of repression. One is the prescriptive one, which mostly involve the legal restrictions by the law, by the policies. And the second one is the reflexive one. Reflexive measures, which are measures based on the situation and in response to the civil society organizations. So the reflexive measures that have been used in different times by different governments in Armenia throughout the last 30 years include the criminalization and stigmatization of human rights defenders' activities, restriction on freedom of expression online and offline, intimidation and violent attacks against civil society actors, attempts to discredit CSOs, and also use of disproportionate force during the protests. Those are basically all in response to the action of the civil society organizations. We can see that there have been violent attacks during different protests, during the Electric Yerevan protests, during the protests for the public park, and during the protest in the race of the public transportation fee, and in many other ways. Another phenomenon, another measure is the establishment of the new NGOs, so-called government-organized non-governmental organizations, which were attracting the funding which have been intended to be allocated for the organizations which are more independent and does not have any political orientation as such. The other measures, which, as I said, includes the restrictions by the law, are the restrictions regarding international funding, domestic laws regulating the operation of CSOs more broadly by imposing new rules on registration, accounting, financial and narrative reporting, policies and practices affecting the rights of freedom of assembly and association, restrictions of CSOs through false counter-terrorism measures. As I said, mostly in Armenian reality, reflexive measures have been used rather than the prescriptive ones, because in terms of the laws, there are not much restrictions on the civil society because Armenia has some international commitments. Another development and another challenge that we can see already and we can foresee for the future is the growing mistrust towards the local CSOs and international organizations which promote democracy and human rights. And this is largely because of their response or lack of the response during the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War and human rights violations that took place during this war in Nagorno-Karabakh and around Nagorno-Karabakh. This is really creating more conspiracy theories around the international organizations which promote democracy in Armenia, and the frustration towards this organization may create hindrances for the civil society organizations which continue working on this topic. And people who have the frustration towards those kind of organizations may stop participating in the activities of these organizations, which is really a challenge for the civil society organizations. Another challenge is the lack of participation and engagement of CSOs in decision making. So the CSOs who have already been involved in decision making before, now they are more involved in the humanitarian work, which means there is a huge gap in the participation of the CSOs in the policy making. So as there are different priorities now, there is a challenge, there is a risk that the participation in this political participation of CSOs may not be prioritized in this case. Lack of financing for the local CSOs to boost democratic participation is another challenge which comes due to the economic crisis and due to prioritization of the funding for the civil society organizations. As there are more problems in terms of the humanitarian crisis, there is a risk that the funding will be shifted to more of a response projects rather than on promoting democracy and human rights, which is also an issue. Another challenge which is already existing is the growth of nationalistic and chauvinistic civil initiatives as well as politically motivated NGOs. And after the war, especially people who have not been happy with the results of the war have started to come up with more nationalistic ideology and chauvinistic ideology, which may challenge the independent civil society to work and to make some changes and to further their agenda of political participation, human rights, and democratization of Armenia. To conclude, we can say that in recent years, especially after the development of the NGO law, civil society law, a lot of NGOs, a lot of civil society organizations has been established in Armenia and transformed from being a humanitarian response NGOs to more of need-based NGOs which respond to the needs of the local communities. And these developments have really affected on the democratization of Armenia in a more positive way. However, besides the developments, we have also witnessed repression against the civil society organizations, especially against the ones who are more active in the political matters and who challenge to the policy making of the governments. After the Nagorno-Karabakh war, we can foresee that the shrinking space issue in Armenia may grow, creating more hindrances for the civil society organizations working on the human rights and democratization. To conclude, we can say that the vital role of civil society in Armenia has been there always in terms of democratization and also in terms of responding to the humanitarian crisis in Armenia. And the space of the civil society should be enlarged rather than shrunk in order to have a more comprehensive approach to the issues that our society faces after the war and even before the war. So we believe that the enlargement of the space and the cooperation between the different actors is the key to the development and the further democratization of the Armenian society.